an image from our Lenten devotional book. Those of you who have the book, some of you are coming to the group on Wednesday night. There was an image in Wednesday's reading that kind of caught my eye. The writer, Joe Cady, for that particular day, spoke of something called a bodily infusion. And he described it in his life was an experience of walking near a bridge when all of a sudden he looked up and he saw this great horned owl and her two babies. And he described how he felt overwhelmed with gratitude in seeing one of these seldom seen yet magnificent creatures. And he said it was not just a little feeling of gratitude, but the kind where it kind of washes over your whole being. And he goes on to write about how being infused or overwhelmed with gratitude sometimes also happens in community. A couple of weeks ago, several of us who were sitting at Tim Hortons enjoying a cup of coffee had just this kind of an experience. Across from us, at another table, sat 3 or 4 young men whom I presume worked at the Global Technology Center, and we've seen them there before. They come over on their coffee break. This time, though, as they gathered up their things and got their jackets on, one of them came right over to our table, and they smiled at Annie Green, and they told her she was cute. Now, I have Annie's permission to share this story. And the rest of us all got this great giggle about this, and so did the people at the other surrounding tables who were there. They kind of were able to overhear this comment. And we couldn't help but think that maybe Annie reminded him of his grandmother. But whatever it was, we just left the day. We left Tim Hortons that day with this great big smile. We all had big smiles on our faces, and we were somewhat refreshed and transformed even after this brief yet meaningful encounter with someone different, someone who took the time to notice and to make that simple connection. That experience reminded me of how through the simplest of encounters such as this, bridges can be built between the most unlikely of people. And often such experiences can infuse us with gratitude and send us off into new directions, both refreshing us and renewing our faith in the goodness of people and in the power of the Spirit to sort of sweep through our lives, our ordinary everyday lives, and our ordinary moments. But the key is in being alert and being ready to engage the stranger. Whether that is the person at the cash register or the person standing in line with us or just simply someone who presents to us with a need. Jesus was certainly one who engaged all kinds of people in conversation. Last week we overheard, I guess, his conversation with Nicodemus, a well-respected member of the synagogue. And we heard that it was a conversation that was filled with all kinds of metaphors and symbols and questions, seemingly designed to push Nicodemus to new understandings, to new ways of thinking about the Spirit's presence in his life and in the life of the world. This week at the well, we find Jesus initiating a conversation with an unnamed woman. It was a most unlikely encounter for quite a few reasons. First of all, in Jesus' day, men did not normally speak with women in public. And secondly, the woman was a Samaritan and Jesus was a Jew. And these two groups of people had been bitter enemies for hundreds of years, normally avoiding each other's company and avoiding each other's territory at all costs. Now, Jesus could have avoided passing through Samaria, but we're told that he was quite intentional in going there. He knew that his mission was not just among his own people. It was directed toward the whole world. And we heard that last week. God so loved the world. Right? Not just the Jewish people, but God so loved the world. And as this Samaritan woman approaches the well in the noonday heat, she's not expecting to find anyone there. She's hoping to just probably go and draw her water from the well and then just get home as quick as she can. Nonetheless, Jesus engages her in a conversation that has been noted as the longest conversation that Jesus has with anyone in all the New Testament. And like the conversation with Nicodemus last week that played on a literal and a spiritual meaning of the word or the phrase being born again or being born anew or being born from above, this week's conversation centers on a double meaning of the phrase living water. It's only through several movements and questions in the dialogue that the woman comes to understand what Jesus is speaking about when he's speaking about something more than physical water. As a result of the conversation, the woman moves in her understanding of who Jesus is. If you look at that passage, you think at the very beginning, she calls him a man. Then she calls him a rabbi. Then she calls him a prophet. And finally, by the end, she goes back to town and she says to her people, she says, could he be the Messiah? It's through this conversation, through this back and forth between the two of them that they come to understand one another. And the woman ends up leaving the encounter refreshed and renewed, restored by something more thirst-quenching and life-giving than plain, ordinary water from a well. She leaves inspired to share her story of the conversation and how it had changed her. And as much as this story has often been interpreted as one about a prostitute and her shame, that is not the point of the story. The fact that the woman had 5 husbands may have been for any number of reasons, and acceptable reasons in those times. It might have been because her first husband died, and the law required her to marry her husband's brother, and that might have gone on for 5 times, depending on, they didn't live long. And it might have been because her husband had dismissed her for a reason as mundane as maybe even burning the eggs at breakfast. Because in Jesus' day, only the man was permitted to divorce a woman. A woman couldn't do the same thing. And all he had to do was to go outside and say publicly, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And that was it. The woman had no say. However, also, a woman on her own in those days would have been destitute. And the fact that Jesus knew that this woman had 5 husbands need not be interpreted as his scolding of her. For nowhere in the conversation does Jesus condemn her or tell her that she must somehow repent from her sins. He simply sees her difficult and tragic life and recognizes her as a person of value, of importance, of significance, of worth. And as I mentioned, over the course of that conversation, the woman comes to understand that he is a prophet. And that's especially right then when he reveals to her that she had 5 husbands, that she says, okay, yeah, I get it. You're a prophet. You know all about me. In engaging with her, he simply meets her where she is, helping her to understand the good news of God that is big enough, large enough to include both Samaritans and Jews. And at the same time, she becomes the first person to whom Jesus reveals his true identity. When she's kind of debating whether or not he's the Messiah, he says, "I am he." And so as I see it, this is a story much like our unexpected encounter at Tim Hortons a couple weeks ago. It's a story about a woman who leaves the conversation transformed. Much like a story I was listening to this week on a podcast about Sister Helen Prégin, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. She is a Catholic nun, and she wrote the book Dead Man Walking. Remember that? Back in the 1990s, it was made into a movie, and I think it was Susan Sarandon that starred in it. It's about her experience as a spiritual advisor to a man on death row. Her involvement with prison ministry, though, began with a very unexpected encounter. One day, she walked out of an adult learning center in her neighborhood, and a man called out to her. And she said, and this man said, "Hey, Sister Helen." And he carried in his hand a clipboard. And he was approaching everyone on the street. And he was saying, "You want to be a pen pal to someone on death row?" Well, she didn't know much at that time about the death penalty. But she knew that if someone was on death row, then they had to be someone who was poor. And she knew that she was called to serve the poor. Besides, how hard could it be, she thought, to write a letter? She said, "I'm an English major, after all." But she now describes this as her first encounter with what she calls sneaky Jesus. Sneaky Jesus. The Jesus who kind of sneaks up on you and draws you in with something that at first seems harmless enough. "Oh," she said, "I'm only writing a few letters." But then she got a letter from her pen pal on death row, a man named Pat Saunier. And he said that he never got any visitors. So she went to visit him. And then Saunier asked her to be his spiritual advisor. And she said yes. But not knowing then that when he was put to death, the only person who could be with him all the way to the end was his spiritual advisor. Sneaky Jesus meets us where we are and draws us to places we never thought we'd go. And she said, looking back on that, she said, that day on the street, signing her name on that clipboard, she said, "I could not have foreseen that I would have been the face of love that Pat Saunier saw as he was put to death, or that his life and his death would ignite in her a calling to speak out against the death penalty and for the love and forgiveness of all God's children." Had it not been for that initial conversation and that engagement in the conversation from that unexpected man on the street, Sister Helen's life and mission would not have gone in the direction that it did. She's now about 80 years old. Holy conversations are like that. They draw us into places that we might normally not have gone. They leave us transformed. They tear down walls and they tear down boundaries that connect us as human beings, as people of worth and value. And they open us up to the possibility of something more. And they challenge us to share the good news with others. What if, as our curriculum suggests this week and encourages us, what if we saw Lent not so much as a time to give up something, but rather as a season to move toward people, to toward new people and new places, to listen to strangers, people that are often overlooked. Maybe in the midst of this pandemic, might be calling us to do that. And there may be people we see or hear every day, and we may never have talked to them. Or maybe if we've talked to them, we've maybe never ever had what we would call a deep conversation with them. Difference between having a deep conversation and just talking. And maybe there's someone you know that needs a listening ear. Or just the sense that you're interested generally in opinions and feelings and beliefs that maybe are a little different from your own. What if, as our curriculum encourages us, what if we were to treat every conversation as though we were having a chat with Christ? What if we were to do that and see what happens? Who knows where these unexpected encounters might lead us? And who knows, maybe we too could become aware of the sneaky Jesus. As Dr. Seuss says, oh, the places we could go. Amen.